They said the Duke of Ravenscar had not allowed a single note of music inside his house in 7 years. The servants said it the way people say a thing they have long stopped questioning, flatly, with their eyes turned aside, as though the not saying of it had worn a groove into them over the years. No singing in the corridors, no whistling in the stable yard. The great pianoforte that had once stood in the drawing room had been carried out one grey morning and never spoken of again, and the west wing, where the music room lay behind a door with a lock the size of a clenched fist, was simply the west wing, a direction and not a place. One did not go there. One did not ask why. Clara Ashworth learned all of this in her first week at Ravenscar Hall, and she learned it, for the most part, from silence, from the way a housemaid's humming died in her throat when Clara passed, from the muffled clocks whose chimes had been wrapped in, felt so that the hours fell soundless through the house, from the particular hush that lay over the manor like a second dust sheet, grey and cold and total. She had come to a place that was holding its breath. She had married the man who would not let it exhale. She had not married him for love. No one at Ravenscar pretended otherwise, least of all Clara, and there was a strange mercy in that honesty. Love was not asked of her. What had been asked of her was simpler and heavier. Her name upon a settlement, her hand set to the marriage lines beside his, and in exchange the ruin that had gathered over her father's house all that long autumn would be lifted as cleanly as a hand lifted from a keyboard. She had understood the terms. She had signed them. And she had come to live behind these tall, cold walls, fully expecting to be wretched, and fully resolved to bear it without complaint. What she had not expected was the piano. She could not have named, in those first uncertain days, why the sealed room at the end of the west corridor drew her so. She only knew that she felt it the way a player feels a held note somewhere out of sight. A pressure, a waiting, a thing left unresolved. Behind that locked door, she would come to learn, stood a grand piano with a warped and blackened lid, its keys blistered by fire, a grey sheet thrown over it like a shroud drawn across something that had not been permitted to die and had not been permitted to live. No one had touched it in 7 years. No one had opened the shutters, or swept the ash from beneath the pedals, or lifted the fallboard to see whether, under all that ruin, a single string might yet be coaxed to sing. Clara Ashworth had been raised to believe that a house without music was a house holding its breath. She looked at the sealed door and at the scarred and silent man she had married, and without yet understanding what she was promising, she promised the silence that she would give it back its voice. This is the story of how she kept that promise. It is the story of a burned piano and the truth it had been keeping, of a man the whole county called a monster, and the grief that wore his scars for him, of a locked room that everyone believed hid a crime, when all it had ever hidden was a loss too large to look at directly. It begins, as such stories so often do, with a debt. The debt was her father's, and Edmund Ashworth was not a wicked man, only a hopeful one, which in matters of money can amount to very nearly the same thing. He was a stooped, grey, templed gentleman in a threadbare bottle-green frock coat, and he had inherited a comfortable living and an unblemished name, and across a dozen soft and careless years he had lent the one and staked the other, always certain that the next venture would set the last one right. There had been a shipping share that went down in a winter gale. There had been a mine that filled with water before the first good seam was reached. There had been notes renewed and renewed again, until the renewing itself became the ruin. And by that autumn the men who held his paper had stopped smiling when they called at the door. Clara had watched it all happen from the pianoforte in the corner of the parlor, which was the place from which she watched most things. She was a slender woman, with dark hair coiled low and ink-stained fingertips, in a modest dove-grey gown, and if the failing household had a heart still beating through those anxious months, it beat in her hands. She brought no fortune to anyone. What she possessed was music, hours of it, patient and exact, the one inheritance her mother had left her before the fever carried her off, and the one thing in all the sinking house that no creditor could seize. She played in the evenings while her father read the same grim letter over and over, without truly seeing it. She played to keep the rooms from going as silent as she feared they soon must. It was her music, in the end, that had reached the Duke, though Clara would not understand that for a long while yet. The offer came in the depth of autumn, carried up the lane by the Duke's man of business. A spare and colourless gentleman named Mr. Sowerby, who wore black, and spoke as though every word cost him a coin he resented spending. He sat in the shabby parlour with his hat upon his knee, and laid the matter before Edmund Ashworth without ornament. His Grace the Duke of Ravenscar, he said, had lately come to hold the greater part of Mr. Ashworth's debts, having purchased the paper from the townmen who despaired of ever seeing their money returned. His Grace was prepared to cancel every farthing of it. He asked in return one thing only, and it was a thing that Mr. Ashworth alone could not give, but that his household might. Edmund Ashworth had gone very still, and then very red, for he was not a stupid man, and he had grasped, before Mr. Sowerby finished, exactly what was meant. The Duke required a wife. The reasons were his own, and Mr. Sowerby did not pretend to furnish them. There was mention of a settled establishment, of a lady to keep his house, of matters of succession that a gentleman in his position could not indefinitely neglect. What the Duke did not require, Mr. Sowerby said with the faintest curl of distaste at his own errand, was affection, or society, or any pretense of an ordinary union. The lady would live at Ravenscar Hall. She would want for nothing. She would be, in the eyes of the law and the county, the Duchess of Ravenscar, and in exchange her father would walk free of every debt he owed. There was a silence in the parlour then that Clara would remember for the rest of her life, for it was the silence into which the whole of her future dropped, like a stone let fall down a well too deep to hear it strike. She had been sitting at the pianoforte, of course. Her hands had gone quiet upon the keys. She heard her father begin to refuse, heard the crack of shame and fury in his voice as he told Mr. Sowerby that he would not sell one who was dearer to him than his own life, that he would sooner go to the Debtors' Gaol and rot there. And she believed him. That was the terrible part. She knew that he meant it, that he would indeed choose the gaol, and that in choosing it he would take down with him the 2 frightened housemaids who had not been paid since Michaelmas, and the old groom who had nowhere else in the world to go, and the very name Ashworth, which would become a byword and a warning for all the years that came after. So Clara rose from the pianoforte and crossed the worn carpet and set her ink-stained hand upon her father's shaking shoulder and said quite steadily that she would do it. They quarreled about it for 3 days. Edmund wept, which she had never seen him do, not even at the graveside years before. He called himself every hard name a man can call himself, and meant each one. But Clara had made her decision in the single breath it had taken her to cross the parlor, and she did not unmake it. She was not, she told him gently, being sold. She was choosing. There was a great deal of difference between the two, and she intended to hold to that difference with both hands, for she suspected it might prove the only thing at Ravenscar that would be entirely her own. What did she know of the man she had agreed to marry? Only what everyone knew, which was rumor dressed up as fact. That the Duke of Ravenscar was a recluse who had not been seen in society for 7 years. That his face and his hands were terribly scarred, ruined by a great fire that had swept a wing of his house. That someone had died in that fire, though the county could never quite agree upon who. That he kept no company, gave no dinners, sat no more in his family pew, and that the manor over which he brooded had gone as dark and shut as a tomb. Wayward servants were warned to behave, or the Ravenscar monster would come for them, which is the sort of thing people invent about a man they have decided to fear, so that they need not trouble themselves to understand him. Clara listened to all of it and set most of it aside. She had spent her life among people who mistook the surface of a thing for its whole, who heard a difficult passage and called it noise, because they had not the patience to learn its shape. She resolved to reserve her judgment of the Duke of Ravenscar until she had at the very least laid her own eyes upon the man. It was a small resolution. It would prove in the end to be the most important she ever made. The wedding was a quiet, comfortless affair in a cold country church, the banns read to empty pews, the vows exchanged between two people who had spoken together perhaps a dozen words. The Duke came veiled in the shadow of the porch and kept the marked side of his face turned from the meager light, and Clara, standing beside him, was aware chiefly of his great height, and of a low voice that spoke the responses as though each were a weight carefully set down, and of the fact that his gloved hand, when it briefly touched hers, was trembling very slightly, and that he had done everything within his power to keep her from noticing it. She noticed everything. It was, after all, what she did. And then the register was signed, and the bargain was complete, and Clara Ashworth, who had entered the church, owed nothing, and owning nothing but her music, walked out of it the Duchess of Ravenscar, bound for a great dark house at the edge of the moor where, she had been given plainly to understand, no music had been permitted to sound in 7 long and silent years. Ravenscar Hall rose out of the moorland dusk like a thing that had been built to keep the weather and the world at arm's length. It was a long, grey, many-chimneyed house, older than its lawns, with tall windows that gave back the last of the light without letting any of it in. As the carriage turned up the avenue, Clara counted those windows out of habit, the way she might have counted the bars of a piece she did not yet know, and she saw that a great many of them were dark, and that one whole range of them, along the western end, had been shuttered from within, so that the house seemed to be sleeping on one side and merely brooding on the other. She was met at the door not by her husband, but by his housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt was a stout, grey-haired housekeeper in a plain black dress and white apron, a ring of iron keys at her waist, and she stood upon the step with a branched candlestick held high, and studied the new Duchess with a frank, unhurried attention that Clara found she did not resent. There was grief somewhere far back in the woman's eyes, old and settled, the way there is water at the bottom of a deep well, but there was no unkindness in her, and when she spoke her voice was low and steady. "You'll be tired, Your Grace," she said. "I've had a fire lit in the blue room and something hot sent up. His Grace keeps late and dines alone. You'll not be troubled tonight." It was, Clara understood, both a courtesy and a warning, and she accepted it as each. The hall within was vast and shadowed, panelled in dark oak that swallowed the candlelight, and it was here, crossing it, that Clara first felt the silence of the place settle over her like cold water closing above her head. It was not merely the absence of sound, it was the presence of a great withholding, as though the house were full to the rafters with things that were not being said. Their footsteps echoed. A long case clock stood against the wall with its pendulum swinging, but no tick came from it. When Clara glanced, she saw that the works had been muffled, the striking hammers bound in felt, so that the hours passed over Ravenscar without a voice. "The clocks don't chime," she said. "Not quite a question." "No, Your Grace." Mrs. Pruitt did not slow, not for a long while now. They climbed the great staircase, and along the gallery, and everywhere Clara looked she found the same grey hush laid over everything, the furniture shrouded in the rooms they passed, the mirrors turned or covered, the whole west end of the gallery closed off behind a set of double doors that Mrs. Pruitt did not so much as glance towards. Clara glanced towards them for both of them. She could not have said why. She only knew that of all the shut and shrouded rooms in that shut and shrouded house, it was the one behind those doors that seemed to lean towards her out of the dark. "What lies that way?" she asked. Mrs. Pruitt's step did not falter, but something in her back went stiff, the way a held note goes taut before it breaks. "The west wing, Your Grace. It is kept locked. His Grace does not go there, and asks that no one else should." A pause, weighted precisely. "There is nothing in it now but dust." It was the first lie anyone told Clara at Ravenscar, and she knew it for a lie at once, not because Mrs. Pruitt was a poor liar, but because the woman's voice, saying nothing in it now but dust, had gone as gentle and as careful as a hand laid over a wound. One did not guard dust like that. One did not lower one's voice for an empty room. Clara said nothing more. She had learned, at her father's failing table, that the surest way to be told a thing was to stop asking for it. But she marked the doors as she passed, marked the heavy old lock and the pale scar in the wood where a second bolt had been added later, and she carried the image of them up to the blue room and lay a long while looking at the fire, thinking of all the rooms in her life that had held music, and of this one great room that apparently held none, and had been sealed against the very possibility of it, as though music were a contagion the house could not survive a second time. She met her husband the following evening. She had been 23 hours in his house, and had not yet laid eyes upon him, and she had begun to wonder whether she was expected to pass the whole of her marriage in this manner, a wife by law and a stranger by arrangement, when a footman came to say that His Grace requested the honour of the Duchess at dinner. Clara dressed with care, less from vanity than from a musician's respect for an occasion, and went down to a long, dark dining room where a single branch of candles burned at one end of a table built for 30, and where, rising from the shadow at the head of it, stood the Duke of Ravenscar. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark tailcoat, the right side of his jaw and throat drawn with old burn scars, his face turned 3/4 into shadow, and he had arranged himself and the light with such evident and painful care that Clara understood, in the first instant, how much this meeting had cost him. He had placed the candles so that the ruined side of him lay in darkness. He had chosen the head of the table so that a wife might sit at his left hand and see chiefly the unmarked half of his face. Every line of him was braced. As a man braces for a blow he has decided not to flinch from, and his eyes, when they finally came to hers, held not arrogance, as the county would have had it, nor cruelty, but a kind of exhausted defiance, as though he had already heard every word she might say, and was merely waiting to have it confirmed that she too found him a horror. "Madam," he said, "you are welcome to Ravenscar. I am sorry it is not a happier house." "I am not looking for a happy house, your grace," said Clara, and sat and shook out her napkin, and met his shadowed gaze quite calmly. "I am looking for the one I now live in. I should like to know it." Something moved across the unscarred half of his face, too quick to name. He had expected, she thought, either horror or that worse thing, the bright, determined pity of a woman resolved to be brave, and she had given him neither, only a plain and level interest, and it had unbalanced him. He sat. The dinner went forward. They spoke, stiffly and with long silences, of the road, of the weather on the moor, of nothing, and all the while Clara was reading him the way she read a difficult score at first sight, gathering the shape of him from 100 small signs. The care with which he used his left hand and kept the glove right below the table's edge, the way his gaze went now and then unbidden, towards the west, towards the wing she had been told held nothing but dust, and came back darker each time. The fact that when a footman set down a dish too hard and it rang against the board, the Duke flinched minutely and mastered it, and hated himself for both. He was, she concluded, not a monster. He was a man who had been living for 7 years inside a grief so total that it had walled off half his house and all of his voice, and had persuaded himself, somewhere along the way, that the wall was a kindness he did the world. "There is one matter I must make plain," he said, near the end of that strange meal, "since we are to share a roof. The west wing is closed. It is to remain closed. You will find the rest of the house at your disposal, and Mrs. Pruitt will see that you have whatever you require. You may order the gardens, the library, the still rooms as you please. But the west wing is not to be entered, by you or by any other, upon any pretext. I ask this of you as the one condition of our arrangement." He paused, his voice, which had been carefully level, roughened on the last of it. "There is nothing there that will interest you. There is only a room I keep shut. May I ask why?" "No," said the Duke of Ravenscar, "you may not." And it was said not with anger, but with such raw and sudden nakedness that Clara let the question fall at once, and turned it aside gently, and spoke of the library instead, and she saw his gratitude for the mercy of it move across his face like warmth across cold glass. But she had heard, under the flat refusal, the thing she had been listening for since she crossed his threshold. "A room I keep shut, not a room that is empty, not a room I have forgotten. A room I keep shut, present tense, an act of will renewed every single day 7 years long. Whatever lay behind those double doors, the Duke of Ravenscar was not neglecting it. He was holding it closed with both hands, the way a man holds a door against a flood, and had been doing so for so long that he had forgotten how to set the burden down. Clara went up to the blue room that night and did not sleep. She lay listening to the vast silence of the house, the silence with no chime in it and no music in it and no voice, and she found that she was not, as she had expected to be, afraid. She was something else, something she had not felt since the last good year before her mother died and the debts began. She was curious, and beneath the curiosity, quiet and stubborn and entirely her own, a small resolve was setting like mortar between stones. She had promised the silence she would give it back its voice. She began, that first sleepless night, to consider how it might be done. The days that followed taught her the geography of the house and the depth of its hush. She learned that the servants at Ravenscar moved and spoke as though at a sick bed, softly with lowered eyes, and that this was not fear of their master, as the county believed, but a kind of long communal mourning that had hardened into habit. She learned that a housemaid named Sarah, scrubbing the stairs, would hum under her breath from sheer thoughtlessness, and then catch herself with a stricken hand pressed to her mouth, glancing about to be sure she had not been heard. She learned that the pianoforte from the drawing room had been carried out to a lumber attic and left there under sacking, and that when she asked whether it might be brought down and tuned, 3 separate servants found 3 separate reasons why it could not, and Mrs. Pruitt, asked directly, only said, "I would not, Your Grace. I would not, if I were you," with a look so full of some old dread that Clara let the pianoforte lie. But she could not let the west wing lie. It drew her the way the tonic draws a suspended cord. She took to walking the gallery in the grey afternoons and pausing, as if by accident, before the closed double doors, and once when the house was quiet. She laid her palm flat against the wood and simply stood, listening, the way she might have laid her hand upon the case of an instrument to feel whether anything within it still lived. And she smelled it then, faint and unmistakable through the seam of the doors, not dust, whatever Mrs. Pruitt said. Smoke, old smoke, years old, soaked into plaster and timber and cloth, the ghost of a fire that had burned itself out long ago and never once been aired. Behind these doors, something had burned. And behind these doors, sealed up with the smell of its own burning, something was still being kept. The first crack in the silence Clara made without meaning to. It was a wet afternoon a fortnight into her marriage, and she was standing at a rain-streaked window at the turn of the gallery, watching the water run down the glass and the moor go blue-grey beyond it, and she was so far inside her own thoughts that the music simply rose in her, as it always had, unbidden and unremarkable, the way breath rises. She began to hum. It was a slight private thing, a few bars of an old air her mother had loved, and she hummed it low into the cold glass without once considering where she was. She did not hear him come. She only became aware, between one bar and the next, that she was no longer alone. And she turned, and the Duke of Ravenscar was standing at the far end of the gallery. Quite still, one gloved hand against the panelling, as though he had put it there to keep himself upright. Clara stopped at once. "Forgive me," she said. "I forgot myself." He did not speak for a long moment. His face was in shadow, as he always contrived that it should be, but she could see that something had happened to him, that the few soft bars of that old air had struck him somewhere no words of hers had reached, and that he was fighting, with everything he had, not to let her see how deep the blow had gone. "You need not," he said at last, and his voice was not quite steady. "You need not forgive yourself. It is your voice. It is your house." And then so quietly that she barely caught it, before he turned and went from the gallery with his uneven, deliberate stride. It has only been a long time since these walls heard anything so. He did not forbid her. That was the thing Clara carried away from the gallery and turned over and over in the days that followed, like a stone warm from someone's hand. He had every right, by the plain terms of their bargain, and by the law that made her his, to forbid her humming, as he had forbidden the pianoforte and the chiming clocks and the whole west wing of his house. And he had not. He had stood there with his grief laid open on his face, and told her that her voice was her own, and had gone away to suffer it in private, rather than command her into the general silence. A cruel man would have silenced her. A monster would not have trembled. After that, without ever discussing it, they began very slowly to keep each other company. It started with the library, which was the one room at Ravenscar the hush had not entirely conquered, perhaps because books make their music behind the eyes where no fire can reach it. Clara took to spending her evenings there, and by the Duke took to spending his there also, at first with the width of the great room between them and a book held up like a shield, and then, as the weeks drew the winter in around the house, in the two worn chairs on either side of the library fire, where a man and a woman might sit an hour together and say very little, and yet not be strangers at the end of it. She read. He read. Sometimes she read aloud to him, when the book was one that asked for it, and she had a low, clear reading voice, trained by years of counting time, and she noticed that when she read he let the shadowed side of his face come a little more into the light, forgetting, as the story took him, to guard it, and she was careful never to look, and careful never to look away too quickly either, and by these small and patient courtesies she taught him, without a word, that she was not going to flinch. He was, she found, a man of unexpected gentleness and buried wit, a great reader, a keen and melancholy observer, starved half to death of ordinary human company, and too proud and too wounded to admit the hunger. He knew every path on the moor, and had walked none of them in years. He kept a fine stable and rode out only at dawn, when no one would see him. He had a way of falling silent in the middle of a sentence and looking towards the west, and coming back from wherever he had gone with his mouth set hard, and Clara learned to wait through those silences without remark, the way one waits out a rest in the music, and to be there, plainly, and without pity, when he returned. It was on such an evening, deep in the winter, that he noticed her hands. She had set down her book to build up the fire, and the light caught her fingers, the ink worn into the cuticles that would never quite wash out, the particular strength across the backs of them that comes only from years at a keyboard, and the Duke, watching her, said before he could think better of it, "You play." Clara went still. It was not a question, and she did not treat it as one. "I did," she said carefully, "before I came here. I have played since I was small. It was my mother's gift to me." She looked at him across the firelight. It is the thing I am, your grace, more than it is a thing I do. I have not touched a keyboard in a month, and I feel the want of it the way one feels the want of a language one is forbidden to speak." She watched what her words did to him. She had chosen them, in truth, to do something, for she was done with pretending she did not know that a great burned silence sat at the heart of his house, and that music was the name of it. She saw him understand that she knew. She saw the old defiance rise in him, and behind it the panic. And behind that, deepest and most guarded of all, something that was almost unbearably, hope quickly strangled. "I cannot give you music," he said. His voice had gone rough and low. "Whatever else this house can give you, madam, do not ask it for that. I cannot. There is not a note left in the place. There has not been for 7 years, and there will not be again while I have breath to forbid it." He rose, abruptly, the unmarked side of his face gone white. "I am sorry. I did not choose the terms of your life here lightly, and I know what I ask of you, but this I cannot yield. Do not ask it of me." "I have not asked you for anything," said Clara softly. "No," he said, from the doorway, not turning. "You have not. That is the worst of it." And he was gone, and she sat a long time by the fire alone, understanding that she had found the shape of the wound at last, and that it was larger and deeper than she had feared, and that it had the name of music, and that it lived behind a locked door at the end of the west wing, where something had burned and never been let go. She resolved that night to see inside the room, not to force it, not to break his one condition in anger or in prying, but because she had understood, sitting there, that she could not help him climb out of a grave whose shape she was forbidden to see. She had to know what he was guarding. She had to know what had burned. Her chance came a week later, and it came, as such things do, by an accident that felt at the time like fate. Mrs. Pruitt fell ill of a winter chill and kept to her bed for 2 days, and in her absence the ordering of the house fell in part to Clara, and with it, for the first time, a share of the keys. They came to her on the housekeeper's own iron ring, and Clara knew every one of them by now save 2, a small blackened key she did not recognize, and, heaviest of all, an old long key of dark iron that could fit no lock in the house she had been permitted to enter. She stood a long while in the cold gallery before the west doors with that key in her hand. She told herself she would only look. She told herself he need never know. She told herself a great many things, none of which she believed, and then she fitted the long iron key to the great lock, and the wards turned over with a groan like something waking, and the double doors of the west wing gave inward upon 7 years of dark. The smell met her first, thick and close, the old drowned smell of smoke and char and damp ash that no wind had touched in all that time. Then the cold, a still tomb-deep cold, colder than the winter gallery behind her. She lifted her candle and went in. It was a corridor, panelled like the rest, but blistered. The varnish bubbled and blackened along one wall, where the fire had licked and been beaten back. Portraits hung there yet, their faces ruined, ancestral Ravenscars gone featureless under skins of soot. And at the end of the corridor stood another door, this one ajar upon its warped hinges, and Clara went towards it with her heart beating high and slow in her throat, and pushed it gently, and stepped into the music room. She knew it at once for what it was, though the fire had done its worst there. It was a tall, once beautiful room, its high windows shuttered fast, its walls scorched, its ceiling stained. A great chandelier hung dead above, its crystals grey. Music stands stood about like the skeletons of thin animals, and shelves of music had burned to their spines, and the ash of 7 years lay soft and grey over everything, undisturbed, so that Clara's own footprints followed her across the floor like the first marks in new snow. And there, in the centre of it all, beneath a vast pale dust sheet, gone grey with soot, unmistakable in its shape even shrouded, stood the grand piano. She crossed to it slowly. She set her candle upon a scorched side table, and with both hands she took the edge of the dust sheet and drew it back, and the years of ash rose up around her in a slow grey cloud, and there it was, a fire-scarred grand piano, its long lid warped and blackened, its rosewood case blistered along the treble side where the flames had reached it, some of its keys burned down to the wood, and others whole and yellowed as old teeth. It had been a magnificent instrument once. Even ruined, even shrouded in the ash of the thing that had killed it, it held itself with the grave dignity of a great voice fallen silent. On the music rack, warped but still standing, a sheet of manuscript remained, its edges eaten by fire, the ink of its notes brown and blurred, but the hand that had written it still legible in places. A fine, quick, sloping hand, and across the top, in that same hand, a title Clara leaned close to read by her guttering candle. She had got no further than the first word of it when she heard, behind her in the ruined doorway, the sound of a man's breath going out of him as though he had been struck, and she turned, and the Duke of Ravenscar was standing in the room where no living soul had stood in 7 years, looking at his wife with her hands upon his sister's piano, and his face, for once, wholly and terribly in the light. For a moment neither of them moved, and the ash settled slowly through the candlelight between them. "Get away from it," the Duke said. His voice was very low and it shook. "Get away from it, and get out of this room." Clara did not take her hands from the piano. She had learned, in a month of him, that the thing to do with the Duke of Ravenscar when he was most terrible was to be most still. "I broke your one condition," she said. "I know it. You may be as angry with me as you please, and I will not defend it. But I will not pretend I am sorry that I have seen. Because I think, Your Grace, that no one has looked at this room in 7 years, and I think it has been waiting all that time to be looked at. You know nothing of what this room has been waiting for. He came a step into it, into the ash and the ruin, and she saw the cost of that single step in the way his whole body fought it, as though the floor itself might give way beneath a living man. This was my sister's room. Do you understand me? This was Beatrice's room, and that is Beatrice's piano, and those are the last notes Beatrice ever set her hand to, and no one has any business among them. Least of all a wife I bought to keep a house, who has been here a month and thinks a little kindness entitles her to my grief." The words were meant to wound, and they did, and Clara let them, and stood in the wound and did not move out of it. "Tell me about her," she said. "No, then tell me about the fire." No, but it came out cracked this time, and she saw the whole edifice of him begin to go. 7 years of held silence, buckling like a beam too long, under too great a weight, and she did the bravest thing she had done since she crossed his threshold. She crossed the ruined room to him, through the ash, and she took his gloved and ruined right hand in both of hers, the hand he had hidden below the table on the first night and behind his back ever since, and she held it, and did not flinch, and said, "Julian, tell me how you were burned." She had never used his name before. It undid him. The great shoulders came down, and the breath went out of him in a sound she would never forget, and the Duke of Ravenscar sank down onto the scorched bench before his sister's ruined piano, still gripping her hands as though they were the only fixed thing in a falling world, and he told her. It had been a winter night 7 years before. Beatrice had been the light of the house, the joy of it, a pianist of real and rare gift, so that people had come from 3 counties to hear her play in this very room, and the Duke, who had loved her better than anything living, had sat where Clara now stood and turned her pages, and thought himself the most fortunate man in England. There had been a concert that night, a great gathering, the chandelier ablaze with 100 candles. He had gone out, only for a quarter of an hour, only to see the last of the guests to their carriages. And a candle had guttered, or a draught had taken a flame to a curtain. No one ever knew, and by the time the cry went up, the music room was a furnace, and Beatrice was inside it, and the doors had jammed in their warped frames with the heat. "They held me back," he said. 3 of them, on the lawn, holding me, telling me it was too late, that no one could live in it, that I would only die with her. And I broke their hands off me, and I went in. He was not looking at Clara now. He was looking at the piano, at the place beyond it where the shuttered windows were. I went in through the fire to reach her. I got to the piano. She had fallen against it. I got my arms about her and I carried her out through the burning, and the roof came down behind us as we passed under the door, and I did not feel it take the side of my face. I did not feel any of it. I only felt her weight and the door and the cold air of the lawn. His voice failed, and I laid her down on the grass, and the doctors came, and they could do nothing. She had breathed the smoke. It was the smoke, they said, not the flame. She had been gone, most likely, before ever I reached her. I carried a dead woman out through the fire, and I burned myself to the bone doing it, and it saved no one. It saved no one at all. The silence in the ruined room was absolute. Clara knelt down in the ash before him and looked up into his face. The whole of it. The ruined right side that he had spent 7 years hiding. The burn that ran from his jaw down along his throat. The map of the night he had gone into the fire for love and come out of it alone. And she did not look away. And she did not weep, though she wanted to, because she understood that he had been wept at and pitied and feared and gossiped over for 7 years, and had never once, in all that time, been simply seen. "They call you a monster," she said quietly. "I know what they call me. They have it exactly wrong." She tightened her hands on his. "Julian, listen to me. For I do not think anyone has said this to you, and I do not think you have let them. You did not cause the fire. You ran into it. Those scars are not a mark of anything you did wrong. They are the mark of the only right thing there was to do that night, which was to go in for her, whatever it cost, and you did it, and it cost you this, and it was not enough, and none of that, none of it, is a thing to hide behind a locked door for 7 years, as though it were a crime." She drew a breath. "You have shut this room, and shut the music, and shut half your own face away from the world, because you think the silence is what you owe her. But it is not what you owe her. It is only what your grief has told you, over and over in the dark, until you took it for the truth." He was weeping now silently, the tears running down both sides of his face, the scarred and the whole alike, and he made no move to hide it from her, and Clara understood that this, too, had not happened in 7 years, and that some frozen thing at the center of him had begun, at last, painfully, to thaw. She learned the rest from Mrs. Pruitt when the housekeeper was well again, and had heard from a white-faced housemaid that the west doors stood open and the new Duchess had been within. Clara had braced for anger. Instead, the old woman sat down heavily across the still-room table from her and wept into her apron, and then told her everything, as though a stopper had been drawn from a bottle corked for 7 years. Beatrice had been the sweetest soul in the county, she said, and had loved her brother beyond anything, and he her. It was Beatrice who had filled the house with music and light. And when the fire took her, something in the Duke had gone into the ground with her, and he had sealed the room exactly as the flames had left it, and forbidden a note of music in the house, and turned the mirrors and muffled the clocks and shut the shutters, not out of guilt for a thing he had done, Mrs. Pruitt said fiercely, for he had done nothing but try to save her, but because he could not bear to live in a world that went on making music when Beatrice was not there to make it. He thinks he keeps her, your grace, she said, wiping her eyes, by keeping it all as it was. But he does not keep her. She was never the ash and the shut door. She was the music. And that is the one thing in this whole house he will not let live. That night Clara went back into the music room alone, with a lamp and a soft cloth and a resolve that had hardened past all turning. She did not yet know how she would do what she meant to do. She only knew that she would begin, and that the beginning would be small. She swept the ash from around the pedals. She wiped, very gently, the yellowed keys that remained, and when she had cleaned them, she sat down upon the scorched bench where Beatrice had fallen and Julian had wept, and she laid one finger upon a single key near the middle of the ruined keyboard, one key that looked whole, and she pressed it down. The note that came was faint and thin and a little out of true, and it was the most astonishing sound Clara had ever heard, because it was a sound at all. The string had held. Under 7 years of ash and grief and silence, one string had held its tune well enough to speak, and it spoke now. A single soft note swelling out into the ruined room, and out through the open doors and down the west corridor into the sleeping house. She had not heard the Duke come, and she did not startle when she felt him in the doorway behind her. She let the note die away into the dark. Then she turned and looked at him, and waited to see whether it would be fury. It was not fury. He was standing very still, one hand on the warped frame of the door, and down the whole ruined side of his face the tears were running again. But his eyes, when they met hers, were not the eyes of a man watching a wound reopened. They were the eyes of a man who has heard, after 7 silent years, a voice he had believed gone out of the world forever, and finds that it is only sleeping and might yet be woken. "Do it again," he said hoarsely. "Please, the note. Do it again." And Clara turned back to the piano and found the one whole key in all that ruin, and pressed it, and let it sound, and the Duke of Ravenscar came into his sister's music room, and stood beside his wife in the dark and the ash, and listened to the single note as though it were the whole of the music of the world. After the night of the single note, the house began, very slowly, to change. It was not a sudden thing. and Clara was careful that it should not be. She had learned enough of grief by then to know that it cannot be hurried, that a frozen thing brought too fast to the fire will crack rather than thaw, and so she moved by inches, and let the Duke set the pace, and asked for nothing she was not first given leave to want. But the shutters of the music room she opened, one pair at a time, over a fortnight, so that light came back into it by degrees and did not shock him. The ash she swept away a little each day, carrying it out herself in a covered pail until the scorched floor showed clean beneath. She did not touch Beatrice's manuscript on the rack, the last thing his sister had written, that she left exactly where it stood, and he saw that she had left it, and something eased in him for the knowing. And one grey morning she asked him, plainly, whether she might send to the town for a man who mended instruments. She watched the old fear rise in him, and this time she saw him master it. "It cannot be mended," he said. "It is burned through. You have seen it." "I have seen it," she agreed, "and so I would have a man who knows such things come, and tell us truly what may be saved and what is gone, so that we are grieving the right amount and no more. Some of it may be past saving, Julian, but some of it held. One string held 7 years. I should like to know how many of its brothers held with it." He was quiet a long while. Then he said, "Send for him," and turned away to the window and added, so low she nearly missed it. Beatrice would have hated to see it under a sheet. She used to scold me for so much as closing the lid. She said a covered piano was a smothered voice, and Clara understood that she had been given, in those few words, the whole of his permission, and more, she had been given Beatrice. A little. The living remembered woman instead of the shut and shrouded grief, and she treasured it, and sent for the instrument maker that same hour. His name was Mr. Alcott, and he came from the town 2 days later, a small, spare, courteous man, with spectacles and the patient hands of his trade, and he spent the better part of a day alone in the music room with the ruined piano, while the Duke walked the moor in the cold rather than watch, and Clara sat sewing in the gallery within call. When Mr. Alcott came out at last, his coat grey with old ash, his verdict was careful and it was kind. The case was scorched but sound in its frame. The soundboard had cracked with the heat and must be rebuilt, which was long work but not impossible work. Perhaps a third of the strings were gone, burned or broken or sprung past saving, and must be replaced with new wire matched to the old. Many of the keys wanted new ivories, and the whole action must be taken apart and cleaned and set to rights, and the whole of it tuned and tuned again over months as the new soundboard settled. It would be slow, it would be dear. But the instrument, Mr. Alcott said, taking off his spectacles to say it, had been a very great one, made by a very great maker, and such things did not die easily, and if her grace wished it, it could be brought to sing again. "Not I," said Clara. "It is not for me to wish it." And she went out onto the wet moor to find her husband, and stood beside him in the wind with the grey house below them, and told him what Mr. Alcott had said, and then said nothing more, and let the wishing be his. He wished it. It took him the length of that walk, and she felt the struggle in the silence beside her. 7 years of held grief pulling one way, and something newer and more frightening pulling the other. But at the turn of the path he stopped, and looked down at the shuttered western end of his own house, and said, in a voice gone strange with the effort of it, "Let him do the work." whatever it costs. Let him make it sing. And Clara took his ruined right hand in hers, there on the open moor where any groom might have seen and she did not care, and held it, and that was all, and it was a great deal. So the work began, and with it a winter Clara would remember all her life. Mr. Alcott came and went, and craftsmen came with him, and slowly the music room filled with the sounds of its own mending, the tap of tools, the ring of new wire drawn to pitch, the low talk of men at careful work, sounds that were not yet music but were the promise of it, and the Duke took to coming to the doorway to listen, and then to standing within, and then one astonishing afternoon, to lending his own hands to the lifting of the rebuilt soundboard, so that Clara, glancing up, saw the master of the House of Silence bearing the weight of his sister's piano beside a workman as though it were the most natural thing in the world. In the evenings Clara set herself another labor, one no craftsman could do for her. Beatrice's music had burned with the room, whole shelves of it gone to ash, but some had survived in scorched and broken fragments, and the last manuscript still stood on the rack. The sonata his sister had been composing the winter she died, unfinished, its final pages eaten by the fire. And Clara, who wrote a fair, clear hand and had copied music since she was small, began of an evening to copy it out afresh, salvaging what she could, ink over the brown blur of Beatrice's burned notes, a slow act of resurrection carried out by candlelight with her ink-stained fingers, so that a thing very nearly lost was set down whole and clean upon new paper and given back its chance to be played. She did not tell the Duke she was doing it. She meant it for a gift, when the piano should be ready, and she hid the fair copies in the blue room and worked at them in the small hours, and was happier over that stolen work than she had been in years. Not everyone wished the House of Ravenscar well, ill in its slow waking. Word travelled, as it does, that the scarred Duke had taken a wife, and that the wife was opening what he had shut, and the county which had been so comfortable in its story of the monster did not care to have the story spoiled. There were those who came calling now, out of curiosity dressed as courtesy, to see the woman who had married the horror of Ravenscar, and there was an afternoon Clara did not forget, when a Lady Marchmont and two of her acquaintance sat in the drawing-room and, believing the Duke safely out of hearing, and the Duchess safely a fool, spoke of him. "They say he did it himself," Lady Marchmont murmured over her tea, with the delicious horror of the well-fed. The fire, that there was some madness in him even then, and the sister knew it, and that is why he keeps the room shut, out of guilt, you know, for what he is. My dear Duchess, you cannot be easy, married to such a man. A face like that is God's own judgment upon the soul beneath. One shudders to think what you must endure. Clara set down her cup. She was aware, as the county ladies were not, that the Duke had come to the drawing-room door and stopped there, unseen in the shadow of it, and had heard. And she found that she was not afraid, and that she was very, very angry, in the cold, clear way that comes to quiet people, perhaps twice in a life. "You are mistaken, Lady Marchmont," she said, and her voice was pleasant, and it carried, in every particular, "you are mistaken, and I will tell you how, since you have travelled so far to be wrong in my drawing-room. My husband did not set that fire. He ran into it. The scars you find so instructive to shudder at, he took carrying his sister out of the flames with his own arms, when 3 grown men had judged it hopeless and held him back, and he broke their grip and went in regardless, because he loved her more than his own life or his own face. That is what those marks are. They are the plain evidence of the bravest and most loving act I have ever heard tell of, and every soul in this county has spent 7 years mistaking them for the opposite, because it is easier to fear a man than to grieve with him. She rose. You called his face God's judgment. I have come to think it is nearer the reverse. I think if there is any justice above us at all, it looks down at my husband's face, and is ashamed of how this county has read it. You will forgive me. I find I am not at home to callers who have come to enjoy his ruin. Mrs. Pruitt will see you out. There was a silence in the drawing room of a quality Ravenscar had not heard in years, the silence of 3 women who have been told the truth and cannot pretend they were not. They went, and Clara stood shaking by the cold hearth until she heard, behind her, a single unsteady breath, and turned and found her husband in the doorway with his whole face bared and wet and open, looking at her as though she were the first warmth after a long killing winter. You need not have done that, he said. I know, said Clara. I wanted to. And she crossed the room to him, through the ordinary daylight, with no candle and no shadow to soften anything. And she reached up, quite deliberately, and laid her ink-stained hand flat against the ruined side of his face, the side no living person but she had touched in 7 years, and she felt him go utterly still under her palm, and she held it there, and did not flinch, and said, There, you see, nothing to shudder at. Only you. For a season it seemed to Clara that the winter of Ravenscar might truly end. The piano grew whole again under Mr. Alcott's hands. Her husband smiled, rarely and then less rarely, and let the candles fall where they would at dinner, and walked the moor with her by daylight. And once, coming upon her humming in the gallery, stopped, and listened to the end of the air with his eyes closed, and something like peace upon his ruined face. She had begun to hope. That was her error, if it was one, though she could never afterward think it truly a fault. She had let herself believe that grief once thawed would keep on thawing to the spring. But grief does not run in a straight line, and there was a date upon the calendar that the whole of Ravenscar had been moving towards without once naming it, and as it drew near, the Duke began to go from her. It was the anniversary of the fire. 7 years, that winter, since the night the music-room burned and Beatrice died in it, and Clara had not marked how near it stood until she saw its shadow fall across her husband. He grew quiet in the old way, and then quieter. The smiles went. He looked towards the west again, with the old hard set to his mouth, and flinched from the sound of the workman's tools, where a fortnight before he had borne the weight of the soundboard in his own arms. And 3 days before the anniversary, Clara came up from the still room to find the music-room dark, the newly opened shutters closed once more, the workmen dismissed, and her husband standing alone in the gloom with the great grey dust sheet in his hands, drawing it back over the half-mended piano as a man draws a shroud over a face he cannot bear to look upon. "Julian," she said, "what are you doing? What I should never have stopped doing." He did not turn. He settled the sheet over the burned rosewood with a dreadful gentleness. "I have been mad these last months. I let you open this room and I told myself it was mending, and all it ever was forgetting. She died here. Do you understand? In 3 days it will be 7 years since she died in this room, and I have spent the season since you came filling it with hammering and new wire and your humming in the gallery, as though a little music could be laid over her death like a clean sheet over ash. It cannot. I will not have it. The room will be shut again. The work will stop. I was wrong to let it begin. You were not wrong. Clara came into the dark room, her heart going hard and slow. You were healing. There is a difference, and your grief cannot tell you the one from the other, and so you must let me tell you. Beatrice is not more dead because her piano is mended. She is not better honored by ash than by music. You know this. You told me yourself she scolded you for so much as closing the lid. Do not, he said, lo, use my sister against me. I am not using her against you. I am trying to give her back to you. But she saw it was no use, that the nearer thing had him now, the black anniversary tide that came up every year and drowned him, and that this year it had found in her opening of the room, and her hope and her tenderness, only more to be guilty of. He turned at last, and his face in the gloom was the face of the first night, shut and defended, the drawbridge up. And what he said then, he said to wound, and he chose the wound with terrible precision. I bought you, he said, to keep a house, not to physic me. You have done a great deal more than the bargain asked, and I am sensible of it, and I release you from it. You need not go on with this. You need not touch my face, or defend me to Lady Marchmont, or sit up copying the burned music of a woman you never knew, all to earn a place you already hold by law and cannot lose. Whatever kindness you have shown me, I know its root. It is duty, or it is pity, and I will not have my sister's memory disturbed to feed either one. Go back to the rest of the house, madam. Leave me the west wing. It is the one thing I asked of you, and I am asking it again. It was cruel, and it was meant to be, and it was also, Clara understood even as it cut her, a lie he needed to believe more than he needed to hurt her, because if her kindness was only duty then, he was safe from the far more terrifying possibility that it was not. She might have wept. She wanted to. Instead, she stood very straight in the ruined room and let the words go past her, most of them, and caught the one that mattered. You are a coward, Julian Hale, she said quite gently, in this one thing and no other. You went into fire for her without a thought. And you will not risk being loved, because being loved means you might lose it, and you have lost enough. I understand it. I do not blame you for it. But do not tell me my heart's business, and call it pity, for you do not know the first note of what is in it, and you are too afraid to learn. She turned at the door. Shut the room if you must. Draw the sheet. But you cannot shut what I feel, and you cannot forbid it as you forbade the clocks, and in 3 days, on the night she died, I mean to prove it to you, whatever you have locked. She did not sleep that night, nor the next. She sat up in the blue room, with Beatrice's music spread before her, the fair copies she had made in secret, and the last scorched original from the rack, which she had at last taken up to finish, and she worked at the unfinished sonata by candlelight, note by burned and blurred note, trying to hear across 7 years what a woman she had never met had been reaching for when the fire took the pen from her hand. And it was there, bent close over the last surviving page, that Clara found the thing that changed everything. Along the top of the first leaf, where a composer sets the dedication, Beatrice had written a line in her fine, quick, sloping hand, and the fire had eaten the end of it, but the beginning stood clear, and Clara had passed over it a dozen times as a mere title. Now, by the steadier light of a fresh candle, she read it whole for the first time. For my dear brother, it said, against the darkness in him, this and there the burn took the rest, the name of the piece gone to ash. For my dear brother, against the darkness in him. Clara sat back. She understood, all at once and completely, what she was holding. The last thing Beatrice Hale had ever written, the music she had been composing the very winter she died, she had been writing for Julian. Against the darkness in him. His sister had known the shadow in her brother long before the fire ever gave it a face, had known it, and had set herself to answer it the only way she knew, with music, with a piece made expressly to reach the dark place in him, and let a little light into it. She had died before she could finish it. And for 7 years it had stood on the rack in the shut room, the one gift that might have saved him, sealed away by the very grief it had been written to heal. "Oh, Beatrice," Clara whispered to the empty room, to the woman she would never meet and had somehow come to love. "You were trying to do exactly what I am trying to do. Let me finish it for you. Let me give him the thing you meant him to have." And she bent again to the burned page, and worked until the candle guttered and the cold grey anniversary dawn came up over the moor, finishing, in her own ink and her own careful hand, the sonata a dead woman had begun against the darkness in the brother she loved, and when it was done whole at last, the living hand completing what the lost one had started, Clara gathered the pages and held them to her, and knew what she would do the following night. Though the room were shut against her, and the piano shrouded and her husband set with all his grief to forbid it, the night of the anniversary came down cold and clear over the moor, and Ravenscar Hall lay dark and silent, as it had lain every such night for 7 years. The Duke had shut himself in his study, with the door locked, and a decanter he did not touch. The servants had gone soft-footed to their beds, as they always did on this night, as though the house were laid out for a funeral, and Clara Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscar, took up a branch of candles and the finished sonata, and went alone to the west wing to keep a promise she had made to a silence on the first night she ever slept beneath that roof. The great iron key was hers again. She had never given it back. The wards turned over with their groan like something waking, and the double doors gave inward, and she went down the scorched corridor past the ruined portraits, with her candles throwing their light along the blistered walls, and into the music room, and set her lights about the great shrouded shape at its heart. Then she drew the dust sheet back for the last time, folded it, and laid it aside, and looked at what the winter's work had made. The piano was mended. Not perfectly, for Mr. Alcott had said the tuning would go on settling for months yet, and some scars no craft could lift. The long lid was still darkened where the fire had reached it, and would always be, and along the treble side the old burn showed through the new polish, like a memory that would not be entirely smoothed away. But the soundboard was whole, and the strings were true, and the keys were clean, and even under her hand, the burned ones replaced, the yellowed ones cleaned to a soft old ivory. And when Clara sat down upon the bench where Beatrice had fallen, and Julian had wept and lifted the fallboard clear, the instrument that waited for her was not a ruin any longer. It was a piano. It was, beneath the marks it would always carry, exactly the great voice it had been made to be, only silent, only waiting, only 7 years unspoken. She set Beatrice's sonata upon the rack. She flexed her cold ink-stained fingers. And then Clara Ashworth, who had not truly played in half a year, who had married a stranger to save her father and come to love him past all sense or safety, laid her hands upon the keys of the fire-scarred grand piano in the sealed music room of Ravenscar Hall, and began on the 7th anniversary of the night the music died to play. The first chord went out into the room and struck the scorched walls and came back changed, warmed, and Clara felt the whole shut house shudder faintly around her, as a sleeper shudders at the first word of waking. She played softly at first, feeling her way into the settling strings, and then, as the sonata took her, more surely, letting the sound rise, and it rose. It rose out of the music room and down the west corridor, and out through the double doors she had left standing open, and it climbed the great dark stair, and ran along the galleries, and slipped under every shut door in that house of silence. The first music to sound in Ravenscar in 7 years, and it was Beatrice's own music, finished at last, a dead woman's gift to her brother, completed by the living hand of the wife who loved him, going out through the dark to find him. In his locked study, the Duke of Ravenscar heard it, and thought first that he had run mad at last, that grief had finally given him the ghost he had half longed for. And then he knew the peace, knew it in his bones, the sonata Beatrice had been writing that final winter and never finished, that he had believed gone into the ash with her, and he was on his feet and at the door with no memory of rising. He went through his silent house towards the sound, as a drowning man goes towards air. He came to the west wing where he had not willingly gone in 7 years, and down the ruined corridor lit gold now with her candles, and he stopped in the doorway of the music room, and he saw his wife at his sister's piano, her dark head bent, her ink-stained hands moving sure and tender over the keys, and the burned instrument singing under them as though it had never known a day of fire. And the Duke of Ravenscar put his ruined face in his ruined hands and wept, standing in the door, and did not try to stop her, and did not try to hide. Clara played it through to the end. She played the part Beatrice had written and on without a seam, into the ending she herself had made for it, in the small candlelit hours, the living completing the lost. And she brought it home to its last chord, and let the chord ring out and slowly die, and the silence that followed was not the old silence, the withholding, the held breath. It was the good silence that comes after music, full and resolved, the silence of a thing at last completed. Only then did she turn upon the bench and look at her husband in the doorway. "She wrote it for you," Clara said gently, into that good silence. "Did you never know? It is on the page, in her own hand, under the fire. For my dear brother, against the darkness in him. She was writing you away out of the dark, Julian, the whole of that last winter. She did not finish it in time. So I finished it. It is hers, and it is mine, and tonight it is yours. And there is not one note of it that dishonors her. There is not one note of it she would not have wanted you to hear." He came into the room. He crossed the clean-swept floor into the candlelight, into the full warm gold of it, and he did not turn the scarred side of his face away, and he knelt down before the bench, where she sat, as she had once knelt before him in the ash, and he took her hands, the hands that had given his house its voice again, and he pressed them to his mouth, the whole and the burned of him, and when he could speak at last it was not of grief. "I heard you play once," he said, "before any of this, years ago, before the fire, before everything. At an assembly in the town, a woman I never spoke to, at a pianoforte in a crowded room, and I stood at the back, and I have never in my life forgotten the sound. When Sowerby brought me the list of the debts I had bought, and your father's name upon it, I saw your name beneath his, and I told myself I chose you for 100 cold and sensible reasons: an establishment, a settled house, an heir. They were lies, every one. I chose you because some part of me that I had walled up with everything else remembered that you made music, and reached for it without asking my leave, and would not be talked out of it. I did not dare to hope you would bring it back. I think I was afraid you would. And you have, and I find I am not destroyed by it after all. I find I am only at last awake." His voice broke and held. "I told you your kindness was pity. It was the cruelest lie I ever told, and I knew it for a lie as I spoke it, and I said it because I could not bear how much I wanted it to be the other thing. Clara, tell me it is the other thing. I have no right to ask it." "Ask it I must." "It is the other thing," said Clara, and put back the ruined hair from the ruined side of his face so that she might see the whole of him in the gold of the candles, and smiled at him with her heart in it. "It has been the other thing since the gallery, since you told a frightened stranger that her voice was her own. I did not marry you for love, Julian, no, but I have come to it since. By inches, the way one comes to a piece too great to sight read, learning it a bar at a time until one morning it is simply in the hands and cannot be got out again. You are in the hands. You cannot be got out. I should not wish to try." They were married a second time. After that, though no church knew of it, and no register was signed, they married in the reopened music room, in the small gold hours of the anniversary night, over Beatrice's finished sonata, with a promise spoken plainly this time, and meant on both sides, and it was the truer wedding by far. The spring came late that year to the moor, but it came, and it was a different house that met it. The shutters of the music room were taken down and not put back, so that the light came in all day and lay in warm bars across the floor where the ash had been, and the mirrors were uncovered, and the felt was drawn from the clocks, so that the hours chimed again through Ravenscar, sweet and unafraid. Mr. Alcott came a last time in April, and gave the piano its final tuning, and pronounced it as fine as any in England, the burn on its lid and all, and would take no fee, and asked only that he might sit a while and hear her Grace play, which he did, with tears on his spectacled face. Edmund Ashworth came at Whitsun, free of every debt, and stooped a little less for it, and heard his one dear Clara play in a house full of light, and wept to see her so plainly and improbably happy, and stayed a month. And the music room, which had been the sealed heart of the house's grief, became the warm heart of its joy. The Duke had a portrait of his sister brought down from the attic, where he had hidden it, and hung above the piano, so that Beatrice looked out over the instrument she had loved, and the door beneath her was never locked again, and was most often simply left open, so that the music might go where it pleased through the house that had forbidden it. They kept evenings there, in time, small ones at first and then less small, when the Duke of Ravenscar sat unveiled, and unashamed among his neighbors with the firelight full on his face, and dared them, without a word, to find anything in it but a man, and his wife played, and the county, which had come once to enjoy a monster's ruin, came now to hear a duchess make music in a house that had been given back its voice, and went home quieter than it came. On the last night of that first true spring, Clara sat late at the piano, with only one candle burning, playing softly to herself the old air her mother had loved, the one she had hummed into the cold glass on the first afternoon of her marriage, when she had thought herself alone, and her husband came, and stood beside her in the warm dark as he had learned to do, his ruined hand resting light upon her shoulder, and listened to the end of it, and neither of them spoke, because there was no longer any silence between them that needed breaking. The house held music now. It held it easily, the way a well-loved instrument holds a tune, as though it had never done anything else, as though the 7 silent years had been only a rest between the movements, a held breath, long drawn, and let go at last into gold.